Good morning, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here with your hurricane outlook and discussion for the 17th of June. Happy Saturday morning to you. We have quite a bit to talk about today with a couple of areas of interest in the Atlantic Basin. Even though it's only mid-June, we do have these two high potential areas for development, one in the Gulf and the other here out in the tropical Atlantic. And both of these are going to be in some form or another newsmakers over the next several days. And I think especially this system here, if it develops into a tropical storm somewhere in this region, because that's not happened before, dating back to 1851 during this time of the hurricane season. Normally, we don't look this far east. In fact, this is the climatologically favored area for the most part, including the southeast Pacific for this time of year. So this would be fairly unusual. Looking at the satellite animation this morning, this is the visible imagery that is coming in. The line that you see going across there is the transition from nighttime to daytime. And you see, first of all, our system here in the Northwest Caribbean Sea starting to get better organized here just off the coast of Honduras. And we're going to look at this closer in a moment via the vorticity signature chart. And then here's our tropical wave, which is designated as 92L. And it won't be long before this becomes 93L over here, I do believe, and we will see which one of these develops the quickest. Overall, this system is very small. The envelope of energy, not very widespread, so it doesn't have a big reach. It's not a very high amplitude wave of low pressure. And you can see these clouds here streaking off to the north and east out ahead of it, and that would indicate strong upper level winds coming around like this. So it's got a small window of opportunity to develop. That being said, as we will look at in a little bit, the GFS does develop this to an extent, and so maybe that wind shear will change. Remember, the atmosphere is always changing, and so what we have now may not be what we have down the road in terms of shear or negative conditions, and the same holds true when we have favorable conditions. They can turn unfavorable. So speaking of the upper level winds, this is what that looks like this morning. Still have sort of this zonal flow, if you want to call it that, not the same thing as with zonal flow up in the mid-latitudes, but it's moving across the system is what I'm getting at here instead of this clockwise anticyclonic flow aloft. However, notice some of these flags on here are starting to become less and less way up at these altitudes. 150 to 250 millibars would be these light blue colors, and they're only maybe 5 to 10 knots, and so that is not as destructive in terms of wind shear goes. And if we look down here at our tropical wave, 92L, in the area that it is in, deep embedded in the easterlies, light winds aloft, but then there are those shearing winds out ahead of it, part of this trough of low pressure in this upper level low here, and we'll just have to see how all of this evolves over time. Looking at the vorticity signature, and this again shows me sort of the health of the circulation or the vorticity of whatever we're interested in. And look, there it is in the Northwest Caribbean Sea, elongated as it may be, it's certainly there and starting to increase. And then here's our tropical wave. This is down at roughly 6 degrees latitude. There's 10 degrees north right there. Wow. I mean, and when I saw the plots for this on the hurricane models, the initialization was 5.9 degrees north. That's getting on down there deep into the tropics, and it's got a very well-defined vorticity signature as well, which tells me that there is energy there. There's enough for this to survive if other conditions were to allow. And in this case, it's mainly going to be the upper level winds, because I do think that the moisture content of the atmosphere is going to be adequate for this system. The Atlantic's warmer than normal, and the chances of this developing in the absence of these strong winds are probably fairly good. And as such, the Hurricane Center indicating 70% chance for this to go on to develop. Then, as I mentioned, the winds are starting to relax over here. We have this area of anticyclonic flow starting to develop right here over Central America, and if this expands more, assuming that it does, it's probably not going to let up enough to have significant development, but things are changing enough to where the system here in the Northwest Caribbean may be ready to start to develop a little bit more steady over the coming days. So looking at the plots here, this is what we like to refer to as the spaghetti plot, all these different lines of the various models, and this is just a guidance. This is give you an idea of where it's located now, which, like I said, is around almost 6 degrees north latitude. And then I like to look at the spread in the guidance over the next few days. And you can see that it's a fairly tight envelope of different track possibilities for the first 48 hours and even through 72. And then after that time, the tracks, of course, are going to start to diverge more. And none of this is really too much of a concern yet, because it's still just a fairly weak area of low pressure. Not very, obviously it's not a tropical depression or a storm yet. And so, you look at this and you say, okay, this gives us a general idea of where it might be headed. And that would basically zone in here on the Southeast Caribbean Sea, Trinidad, Tobago, the southern Windward Islands. It looks like Barbados here would not necessarily feel the effects too strongly, because again, this is a small system. It's not one of these large, sprawling tropical waves that we see in August and September typically. And so I think the focal point for adverse conditions is going to be down here in the southern Windward Islands. And we'll focus more on that tomorrow, and then certainly by Monday. Monday morning, the system should be still maybe a day or so away, and we have time to talk about impacts. But I think you can plan on gusty winds, squally weather, and maybe, just maybe, tropical storm conditions. If we look at the intensity plot, again, this is all preliminary, so this can change, but I like to look at how everything is either focused or spread apart. And if you have a lot of divergence, then that's indicative of uncertainty. And you can see at least through the next 36 hours or so. Most of the model guidance here has a pretty good upward slope to it into the tropical storm range. And so I think it's safe to assume, for the most part, say 70% chance, right, that this will become a tropical storm. Now, the H-Wharf here, you look at this and you say, oh man, hurricane intensity, look out. Well, it can be pretty aggressive, especially with fledgling systems that haven't even developed yet. And then it's like the thing runs into a wall or something and it drops off at an incredible rate there. Well, I guess not that much over time, 6,208 hours, but that's one heck of a drop back down to basically almost dissipating. From Category 1 to dissipation, something bad happens to that system. So I would look at the H-Wharf in the longer term, and maybe even in the short term, as an outlier. So I would discount this for now. But you look at the rest of the models, enough of them here, indicating tropical storm forming from 92L, that it warrants our attention. So if we look at the GFS, this is from the 6Z run this morning, and I want to point out a few things. Again, this is the 850 millibar chart, about 5,000 feet in the atmosphere, and we're looking at the vorticity, because this shows me, like I say, often the health of our systems. And we notice as we go out 24 hours, this is valid tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, early, 2 a.m. Eastern Time, large area of general counterclockwise flow in the Northwest Caribbean Sea, and 92L is still out here outside of the frame. Moving along to 48 hours, notice with our Caribbean system, it looks like it's trying to focus the energy up here just north of the Yucatan Channel. Whether or not this actually happens, is this just feeding back too much? Well, it's hard to say. But it does give us a clue that in 48 hours, maybe it's going to try to start focusing right here off the western tip of Cuba. And to its credit, the GFS has sort of suggested this for a while now, several days, that this could be a possibility. So we will be looking for that. Going on out to 72 hours, we notice a few things here now. First, this starts to become, it's messy, but there it is, starting to focus that vorticity a little better. So this would be large, sprawling, ugly-looking tropical low. And then here, curiously enough, the GFS coming in with our system here, 92L, right through the islands, Trinidad and Tobago, with some of these wind barbs at 5,000 feet. That one right there, there's a 50-knot flag and another 50-knot flag there, 5,000 feet up, so just short of a mile. So you could, 50 knots is about 60 miles per hour. So, hey, at the surface, 40-knot winds, maybe. I mean, certainly in any convective activity that you would get, you could bring those winds down to the surface. So that's going to be something to watch. The GFS strengthens this as it approaches the islands. Finally, at day 4, we notice that the system coming out of the Caribbean, large, but there it is, trying to focus maybe as a large, very ugly looking tropical storm in terms of the classic appearance. And that's what you typically get in June. You don't have these classic looking hurricanes. Sometimes you do, but usually you don't. Wind shear and other things are not quite in the favorable category enough, which is great news because we don't need anything other than a rainmaker. And even this could bring too much rain. Bottom line, that's not, even though it's more healthy than we have seen in the model, it's still not that classical look. And then down here north of South America, boy, where have we seen that before? Remember Matthew last year? Just the comparative purposes in terms of where this was located relative to Matthew, that's it. The comparison ends there. I do not see this getting anywhere near the strength of Matthew for several reasons, which I think most are obvious. But you notice, why is it going so far south? Well, here's the outline of that real strong western Atlantic high pressure area, pretty deep layer. And so this is just not going to turn into it. It's going to kind of follow this flow. But remember, everything changes, so it's not going to just follow these lines and go on up into the Northeast Gulf, because this could expand, this could connect, or the system could just fall apart here, which is kind of what it shows by day 5. And maybe this is why the HWRF model is basically dissipating it. There's the vorticity signature as this thing just kind of goes away. It comes to the islands and then just kind of falls apart. Meanwhile, if this comes to fruition, big rainmaker for the Florida Panhandle, and then look, in the Bay of Campeche, another area of vorticity trying to slowly organize. So complex pattern coming up for the most part. I think the 92L future is a little bit more certain than what's happening in the Caribbean Sea. Most of the activity, of course, is going to be fairly slow to evolve, and they're far enough away from most land areas that there are no major concerns just yet. And if there are concerns, we will address those here. All right, well, that's what I know for today. I appreciate you tuning in on this Saturday. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow.